It's time to step up your airbrushing game. This video is sponsored by Audible. Hey friends, it's Squidmar time. I'm Emil. I feel like there's a lot of misconception out there about how to use an airbrush effectively and how to make things look good with an airbrush. To me, the airbrush is one of the most powerful tools, and together with a really good brush and a wet palette, I feel like the airbrush is the thing that leveled up my miniature painting faster than anything else. And also, I feel like there was this notion a few years back, not so much anymore, but people used to say that you can see directly when something is painted with an airbrush, and I don't like the style of things that are painted with an airbrush. And to some extent I can understand that, because if you use your airbrush in certain ways, you will clearly have these spraying marks from an airbrush, and you can really tell that something has been highlighted with an airbrush. And today we want to deviate from that and show you the techniques that I use every day in my painting to make my miniatures look better with an airbrush, and really fast as well. And when using these techniques, you won't have the same effect of it looking airbrushed. But really, I guess there's no wrong ways of creating art, so whatever makes you happy with painting, do that technique. But today I'm going to show you what I've learned through the 2 years now that I've been using an airbrush, and how you can apply it to your miniatures. And that leads us to today's 3 topics.
Emil, aren't you forgetting one?
Okay, so the 3 things that we're talking about today is airbrush blending, post shading, and airbrush glazing.
Dude, how could you forget about my favorite airbrushing topic, pre-shading?
And before we get started, if this is the first time you watch a video about airbrushing, I recommend you to go check out this video that I released a few months back. It's about how to get started with an airbrush and how to clean your airbrush and all of that things. I won't cover any of it today. Today is more about the next techniques you take to develop your airbrushing skills. So go watch that one first, and then you come back to this one. A lot of people now might be surprised, but the first couple of layers we're putting down is being done by a brush, not by airbrush. And the reason for that is when we use the brush, we get better coverage than with the airbrush. If we do it, the first base coats with just airbrush, we will have to do a lot of layers to get the same pigment density, the same saturation as if we do it by brush. So I'm just using an old dry brush because it's a big miniature, an old dry brush, and just slapping thick coats on this miniature. I'm sorry, Duncan, 2 thick coats. It's the best way to go. Deal with it. And for this specific miniature, this troll that's sculpted by Leonardo, I will do like a pig-like skin on the belly, because the troll kind of looks like a pig, so I want to have like a pale Caucasian-ish type skin on the belly, and then on the back muscles and the side we will have like a green orcish skin tone. I had to do 2 thick layers on it to cover everything, and it looks great now. And what we're doing now is adding the first set of highlights. And how are we adding these highlights? Well, we're adding it with thick coats again. I'm sorry, Duncan. You'll be surprised how well things are going to look in the end. I'm not going to blend anything together. What's most important in this step is the placement of the highlights. And for the placement of highlights, there's a video in the works about how to work with volumes and where to place highlights to emulate where the light would be hitting. Until then, you have to either look at references, and I will teach more about the light theory later. And this painting style to me is just so forgiving. It's so much fun because it's not about every blend has to be perfect. I'm just working on the highlighting layers, thick coats again, layer upon layer. You'll see in the end that it looks amazing when we start bringing out the airbrush. And while I keep adding these nifty layers to the miniature, let's talk about this week's sponsor, Audible. You all know of Audible at this point, and a lot of you also know that I really don't have a lot of time to read these days with 3 kids and a YouTube channel to run. So how do I get more books into my system? Well, obviously I listen to them while I paint. I myself recently listened to the audio drama Realm Slayer. It's about Gotrek the dwarf who is just smashing his way through the mortal realms. It's an awesome Warhammer book. And in queue I also have this book Dark Harvest by Josh Reynolds. And yes, it's a Warhammer book because yeah, I'm a Warhammer nerd. And really, there are 277 results when searching for Warhammer. That should really set you up for a long time with Warhammer stories. On top of that, on Audible, you can also find anything audio related, such as podcasts, news, bestsellers, wellness programs, if that's what you're into, or maybe just more books about Warhammer, because that's what I'm listening to. And guys, you can join Audible now by going to audible.com/Squidmar or text Squidmar to 500 if you're in the US. And by joining, you get 30 free days, 1 credit every month where you can select 1 audiobook. And on top of that, you also get 2 audiobooks originals from a monthly selection. So with that out of the way, let's bring in the airbrush. Airbrush blending. Airbrush blending is one of these techniques that I feel that I need to practice on a bit, because this is just one of the things that adds so much speed and it makes painting so much more fun and still maintaining that high quality, even though it takes like half the time or even less to paint these large miniatures that I'm painting today, for example. So, what is airbrush blending and how would I use it? Say we're painting a miniature with a large wavy cloak, a large piece of armor, or a large area of skin. We've done a rough sketching going from one shadow to highlights without doing any blending between them. So when you have your shadows and light values sketched out, you can go in with the thinned out midtones between those two colors. So with the pale skin, for example, on this one we're using Bugmans Glow and Cadian Fleshtone and blending it 50-50 in the airbrush. For the greens, I'm using Battledress Green from P3 and I'm thinning it down. You can use just water. In this video, I'm using Airbrush Medium. It's sort of like a mix between thinner and flow improver. It's really a luxury tool, but for me, lately I just found that it's easier for me to clean up the airbrush afterwards. I've been using water just perfectly fine. But when you have this thinned out in your airbrush, what you do is you go in between these where the lines break of the highlight and the shadow and do small bursts of spraying on these areas and you will have a super smooth transition between the two. Just make sure to do these small bursts when you airbrush here so you don't get any speckling or any spider webbing on your miniatures. You want to have these super smooth transitions with a super thin when you're doing it. And I learned this technique from one of my favorite painters, Sergio Calvo, and he's just a master of doing this, and it really makes my painting process more fun, and I think it could do the same for you as well.
Thought y'all could use some more American. I've seen Midsummer. I know how you Swedes act. What up, Squidmarians? I'm Scott the Miniature Maniac, and I'm here to chat with you today about the subject of pre-shading. As many of you know, acrylic paint is considered to be translucent, and what that means for us is that we don't reach full opacity or full coverage in one quick coat of paint. We need multiple. That's why you saw Emil apply 2 thick coats, sorry Duncan, of paint earlier onto his miniature to reach that nice, rich, opaque color. Well, this is often seen as a bad thing with acrylic paint, but when it comes to airbrushing, it's actually super useful. One basic idea that represents pre-shading in a pretty basic way is zenithal highlighting. You have a white to black gradient on your model that represents where light and shadows will fall. From here, you can apply a translucent color like a red, a blue, or a green, and start to develop some basic shadows and highlights for free virtually. There isn't much thinking going on here. We don't have to stress about where to place our highlights and shadows, but we can expand our horizons here. Instead of using white and black, we can use other colors. What about white and red as an undercoat for yellow, or white and blue as an undercoat for green? What about using a metallic instead of white over a black undercoat, and then applying blue to it? So many colors have interesting combinations when applied on top of each other in translucent layers. On your next airbrushing project, I want to challenge one of you Squidmarians to do an interesting pre-shading, whether it's a simple white to black or something a little bit more exotic. All right, I guess I can give you guys back to Emil. Let me just put this back on. Let me just do one more hoot.
Okay, thanks Miniac for that, I guess. Check out Miniac, he's a good YouTuber. And apparently he doesn't know the line between his and mine stuff, but it's okay, I'll let it slide for this time. Post shading. This is definitely my favorite way of using the airbrush. And this is one of the steps that you add in your last steps of painting your miniature. When you've done all your highlights, all of your smooth blends, but you want to add some extra volume to your miniature or shape your miniature in a different way, or just shape it a little bit more with colors and shades. So why is this so helpful? Well, let us compare the two different styles of shading. One of them is with brush. When you shade something with a brush, maybe say a muscle on a miniature, you can shade that area on that specific muscle. But if you're using post shading with your airbrush and you have this figure, for example, that holds its hands up like this, and I can shade larger areas such as the whole side of this miniature and still keeping the original values of highlights that I've placed. So instead of being a local shading, this one is more general, helping you shape the miniature using lights and shadows. For this step you can use both inks and classic acrylic paints, or even go brave and mix both of them. One thing to note, why I often use inks for this, is that inks have a wonderful property with pigmentation being quite high and still being translucent, compared to the classic acrylic paints, which often have a full coverage when you're painting with, say, like a dark brown or a dark green. This one will still let the previous values you painted in shine through. And if you're painting like a dark green or a dark blue, normally it would have a very desaturated blue or very desaturated green, but with this, using the inks, you can still have a lot of colors in your shadows. Another positive thing with inks, why I always recommend people to buy a couple to practice with them, is that they have a little bit more of a satin finish, and in shadows I find this to be a really good strength. It just makes things more vibrant, and it's just my personal taste, but try for yourself and you can see the wondrous world of inks. So if we, for example, are going to shade a large area like this torso, for example, I'm mixing a few drops of blue ink and green ink to create a nice dark to punch the shadows of the miniature. I'm spraying this from slightly below the miniature. It just gives a really nice transition because of its translucency, and it gives me a lot of control to shade any muscle part that I want on the backside, for example, or here on the sides where we want to have more of a punch to give that grander shape of the miniature and give it more volume. And when you start practicing this the first couple of times, you might see that, oh, I kind of deleted some of the highlights that I did before. No worries, it happens to the best of us. And that's also why I recommend to add the final highlights in a step after you've done the post shading. So going in again with the regular brush, just adding the tiny details that you want to have highlighted again, just makes for a really good workflow. Let's talk about airbrush glazing. This technique can be used in so many different ways, and everyone has a different way of doing this. But today I'm teaching you my technique that I use. This is something that a lot of the Spanish painters do, like Sergio Calvo and Antonio Peña. And once again, we're using inks for this step. Well guys, you know we talked about post shading earlier and how this can change the volume of larger areas. This is pretty much exactly the same, but we can color different areas and add tonal variation to it, glazing with inks through the airbrush. A great example of doing this is, for example, when we're doing this orc warrior or a barbarian and you sketched out the volumes already, but you feel like there is some tonal variation, some colors missing, and you want to get some variety to the skin tones. Airbrushing in some magenta inks or red inks on the knees, the elbows, or the hands, or like on this troll, for example, where we want to have like a more natural gradient, where the skin is thinner on the orc, like the elbows and the knuckles, for example. It will give more life to this miniature and make it more realistic than just being like a two-tone, like this pale beige skin tone here, and then the greens we will have some nice reds and magentas on different areas of the miniature. I like this technique a lot, and I use it a lot for steel non-metallic metal as well. Airbrushing in some tonal variations, like this piece for example from Raging Heroes that I did as a commission for a client. I felt when I had painted the skin that I needed some more variation to it, so I added the magenta ink and sprayed on the legs and like the arm and a little bit on the torso to get a little bit more of a pink to the purple. Also on the sword, to make that pop even a bit more, I added some turquoise and green inks and sprayed it on the sword, just to make it more lifelike than the flat gray sword that I had painted originally. And this step can be used in many creative ways. You can take a look at this wonderful shield that Antonio Peña did. I'm not sure he used exactly this technique, but it's very possible if you compare the first work in progress image that he has to the final one. From gray tones and just airbrushing inks on top would give some really nice pop colors. As I said, Sergio Calvo does this a lot as well on like knees on miniatures, elbows, hands for example. And for being like a 1 minute process, it just changes the whole tone of a miniature. Isn't that amazing? And now it's just up to me to add those final highlights that I talked about. And while I do that, before I show my finished example, I just want to thank you so much for sticking around with me, watching this video. Leave likes, comments, feel free to ask questions. Check out Miniac as well. If you're interested in the sponsor Audible, as I said, go to audible.com/Squidmar or text Squidmar to 500 500. I'll add it down here so you can see. And maybe you want to support this channel even more. I have two main ways of doing that. You can either go to my website squidmar.com, use my Amazon affiliate links that I have there or in my video description as well. Pick up any of the gear that I use. I've listed it all on my website. An even better way of supporting this channel is by joining my Patreon family. There are 250 Patreon supporters at this point, which is still so freaking crazy. And by pledging a few dollars, you help this channel keep running, and also you get to join me and these people on a Discord chat where we talk every day about miniatures, life, and just having fun. So guys, here's my final version of the miniature. I will probably go in a little bit more later as well to add some details and polish up things a little bit more, but I painted this one quite fast actually. It was less than a day's work, and I just enjoyed the whole process because I get to skip a lot of these tedious steps of just meticulous blending and working on small separate parts. I get to work on the whole grand piece as a whole, and it just makes my process so much more fun. With that said guys, thanks so much for watching. Have a great day. Bye.